I was checking vitals on my patients when a little girl grabbed my sleeve and whispered, "Please don't leave me alone with the doctor." Her hands shook even as her grip on me tightened. "Sweetie, what's wrong? Did something happen?" I sat down on the edge of her bed and glanced at her chart. 8 years old. Routine appendectomy recovery. Nothing out of the ordinary. I gave her a soft smile and said, "I know doctors and nurses can be a little scary, but your surgery is all done. No more needles, no more pain. Dr. Keenan only wants you to get better." She shook her head furiously in disagreement. "He scares me," she finally said. "I don't want him to come in here. Please." Before I could ask what she meant, the door swung open and Dr. Keenan walked in with his tablet. He smiled at the girl who trembled and stared at me with pleading eyes. "Hello, I'll take it from here. You can go," he told me. I couldn't refuse, but the moment I stood up and saw the smile on his face, I knew something was wrong. And I needed to get to the bottom of things. I went straight to the nurse's station and pulled aside Carla, who'd been working this floor for 15 years. "Have you noticed anything weird about Dr. Keenan? Any complaints from patients?" She shrugged. "Keenan? No, he's one of the good ones. In fact, he was the only one who gave all the nurses gifts last Christmas." "Why?" I frowned, feeling even more lost. "Well, one of the little girls on this floor is completely terrified of him." Carla tilted her head in confusion. "That's strange. I've never heard anything like that about him. Maybe she's anxious? You know how kids can get when it comes to hospitals." I had the same thoughts, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more. I mean, most kids who were anxious about treatment were afraid of nurses too. But this girl wasn't. She was only specifically afraid of him. So I asked 2 more nurses and got the same response. Nobody had seen or heard anything suspicious. But just as I was ready to give up, one of the janitors pulled me aside in the hallway. "I heard you earlier, asking people about Keenan. I saw him doing something strange last week," he said quietly. Then he paused, looking around to make sure nobody else was listening. He was in the medication stockroom, taking things from the locked cabinet and hiding it in his coat. When he spotted me, he just said it was for a patient. But what's weird was when I told him he needed to log it. You know, protocol. He got angry. Told me to mind my own business and stay out of his way. He'd been watching me ever since. I watched the janitor shift around nervously. "Do you remember what he took?" He nodded slowly. "Red vial from the top right shelf. Blue and yellow bottles from the middle shelf in the back." I felt my entire tremble, realizing exactly what those were. Anesthetics, sedatives, medications that could knock someone out or worse if used wrong. "Why didn't you report this?" His face wrinkled up as he said exasperatingly, "I'm a janitor. He's a handsome doctor. Who are people gonna believe?" I patted his shoulder. "I believe you." "Thank you." I turned around and ran back toward the kids' room, but when I entered, the entire room was empty. The bed was made, the monitors were off, and there was no sign of the little girl anywhere. My mind started racing in a panic. I ran to the front desk on the floor. "The girl in that room. Where is she?" The receptionist checked her computer and blinked back at me. "She should be in her room. Nobody's checked her out." I slammed my hand on the counter. "She's not there. What about Dr. Keenan?" He clocked out 20 minutes ago," she stammered. I called security immediately. "I think Dr. Keenan took a patient. 8-year-old girl. Still recovering from surgery. Mousy brown hair." At first they thought it was a joke. But when they pulled up the parking lot footage and saw the doctor carry out the unconscious patient and place him in his personal car, they knew this was serious. The security instantly called the police, handing over the license plate, vehicle description, and issued an Amber Alert. I listened to the radio chatter as they spotted him on the highway heading toward the state line. "Units in pursuit. Suspect vehicle isn't stopping." I couldn't breathe. The guilt of leaving her in that room with him when she begged me not to was eating me alive. I just couldn't wrap my head around it all. Why would a doctor with a clean record suddenly kidnap his patient? Suspect vehicle forced to roadside. Suspect's exiting the vehicle. He's running. Suspect has fled on foot. Child's in the vehicle. Child safe? The officers radioed back. They brought her back to the hospital an hour later, but instead of looking relieved, she was frantic, kicking and scratching and begging the officers to take her back. It made even less sense. I sat down next to her and held her hand. "Sweetie, I don't understand. You were scared. You got kidnapped. Now you want to go back to him? Why?" She stared up at me and said through her tears, "Because he's my dad." Everyone paused. "What?" "He used to hurt us, so Mom and I left him. But he needs me so he can save Mom. He said Mom needs me, but she doesn't want the surgery. Please, take me back. My mom needs me." The officers and I looked at each other wondering the same thing. What now? One of the officers stepped forward and pulled me to the side while another stayed with the girl. The detective who'd been coordinating everything walked through the hospital entrance doors about 5 minutes later. He was tall with graying hair and tired eyes. He flashed his badge at me and introduced himself as Detective Shepard. He guided me down the hallway to an empty consultation room and closed the door behind us. I sat in one of the plastic chairs while he pulled out a small notebook and pen. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I started from the beginning, explaining how the girl grabbed onto me when Keenan walked in, how she specifically said he scared her, how I asked around, but nobody had complaints about him. I told him about Harper the janitor seeing Keenan steal medications from the locked cabinet, the red vial and blue and yellow bottles that I knew were sedatives and anesthetics. My voice cracked when I got to the part about leaving her alone in that room, even though she begged me not to let him in. Shepard wrote everything down without interrupting, just nodding occasionally. When I finished, he asked me to write down the exact medications Harper described and their locations in the supply room. I drew a quick diagram of the cabinet layout and marked where each item would be stored. He thanked me and said he'd need to speak with Harper directly to get his official statement. A woman in a gray blazer arrived about 40 minutes later, carrying a large bag filled with toys and coloring books. She introduced herself to the officers as Summer McBride from Child Protective Services. She had kind eyes, but a no-nonsense expression that made it clear she'd seen too much in her career to be shocked by anything. She asked where the girl was, and one of the officers pointed to a small waiting room where they'd moved her to get her away from the chaos in the main hallway. Summer walked in there, and I watched through the window as she knelt down to the girl's level and started talking softly. She pulled out a stuffed animal from her bag and set it next to the girl on the couch. The girl didn't touch it at first, but after a few minutes, she picked it up and held it against her chest. Summer moved some of the toys and coloring books onto the small table in front of them. The girl's face kept changing from crying to angry to confused. She'd shout something and Summer would just listen calmly and nod. Then the girl would break down sobbing and Summer would hand her tissues. It went on like that for over an hour. I couldn't hear what they were saying through the glass, but I could see the girl's small body shaking with each emotional wave that hit her. Carla found me standing in the hallway and touched my arm gently. She asked if I wanted to sit down for a minute because I looked like I was about to fall over. We walked to the break room together and she poured me a cup of coffee even though my hands were shaking too much to hold it steady. Hospital security had set up in the corner with laptops pulled up showing camera footage from the past month. They were going through every recording of Dr. Keenan's movements in the building, watching him walk through hallways, enter patient rooms, go to the medication storage area. Carla kept saying she couldn't believe it, that he seemed like such a good doctor, that he always smiled and asked about her grandkids and brought donuts for the staff. I watched her process it in real time, the way her face shifted from denial to confusion to something like betrayal. She said she felt stupid for not seeing it, for thinking he was one of the good ones just because he was charming and remembered people's names. I told her none of us saw it, that he was good at hiding whatever was going on inside him. But even as I said it, I realized how easily we all missed the signs because we wanted to believe the best about someone who seemed professional and kind. The security guard reviewing footage suddenly stopped and rewound something. He called over his supervisor and they both stared at the screen, pointing at timestamps and whispering to each other. Detective Shepard found me in the break room about 20 minutes later. He pulled up a chair and sat down across from me with his notebook still in hand. He said Keenan was still running and they'd expanded the search to include all highways heading north and west out of the state. Police in 3 neighboring states had been alerted and were setting up checkpoints at major intersections. He asked if I knew anything about the girl's mother, or why Keenan would say she needs her daughter for surgery. I shook my head and admitted I knew nothing about his personal life. We never talked about family or anything outside of work. He was just the pediatric surgeon who did his job well and went home. Shepard wrote something in his notebook and said they were trying to track down the mother now, but the girl had only given them a first name and said they'd been moving around a lot. He asked if the hospital had any emergency contact information for Keenan, and I told him to check with human resources because nurses wouldn't have access to that. I left the break room and headed back toward where Summer was still interviewing the girl. Harper was standing in the hallway looking nervous and lost. When he saw me, he walked over quickly and asked in a quiet voice if he did the right thing by speaking up. His hands were twisted together and he kept glancing around like he expected someone to yell at him. I reached out and squeezed his shoulder and told him absolutely, that his testimony probably saved that girl's life. He let out a long breath and some of the tension left his face. He said he'd been so worried that he got it wrong somehow, that maybe he misunderstood what he saw, that he'd gotten a good doctor in trouble for nothing. I assured him that what he saw was real and important, and that he should never feel bad about reporting something suspicious. He nodded slowly and said the detective already took his statement and asked him to show exactly where in the supply room Keenan took the medications from. Harper had walked them through it step by step, pointing out the specific cabinet and shelves. Summer finally emerged from the interview room looking exhausted. Her blazer was wrinkled and she had the expression of someone who'd just spent an hour trying to comfort an inconsolable child. She asked if we could talk privately, and I followed her to a quiet corner near the stairwell. She pulled out a small notepad and flipped through her notes before looking up at me. She said the girl's name is Lily Keenan, and she's been living with her mother under a different last name for the past 3 years. They'd been in hiding after fleeing domestic violence. Lily told her they moved twice to different cities to stay ahead of her father. Summer's voice was steady and professional, but I could hear the anger underneath it. She said Lily was terrified to give too many details because she thought her father would find them again, which of course he did because he worked at the same hospital where Lily ended up as a patient. The coincidence was almost impossible, except it wasn't a coincidence at all. Keenan must have been tracking them somehow, watching and waiting for an opportunity. Summer continued talking and I felt sick to my stomach with every detail. She said Dr. Keenan's controlling behavior had gotten worse over time until it turned physical. Gwyneth finally left him 3 years ago when he shoved her into a wall while she was holding baby Lily. Gwyneth grabbed whatever she could carry and ran. She'd been working low-paying jobs and moving every time she thought Keenan was getting close to finding them. They'd been in the city for 8 months and Gwyneth thought they were finally safe. Then Lily got appendicitis, and ended up in the emergency room, and somehow ended up on her father's floor. Summer said Lily remembered her father from when she was little, but mostly she remembered being scared of him, remembered her mother crying a lot, remembered the yelling and the sound of things breaking. She'd spent the past 3 years learning to feel safe again, and then suddenly he was standing in her hospital room smiling at her like nothing had ever happened. 2 hours crawled by while we waited for updates. I kept checking my phone for messages from Detective Shepard. Finally, he called and said they'd apprehended Keenan at a rest stop 40 miles outside the city. He'd pulled into the parking lot and officers surrounded his vehicle before he could get back on the highway. When they ordered him out of the car, he didn't resist. He just got out with his hands up and kept saying the same thing over and over. I just wanted to save her. The officers didn't understand what he meant at first. They arrested him and read him his rights while he kept repeating it like a broken record. Shepard said Keenan was transported back to the county jail and would be formally charged within a few hours. I found Summer again, and she was on her phone coordinating with other social workers. When she hung up, I asked what happens now with Lily. Summer explained that Lily would be placed in emergency foster care while they sorted out the legal situation. She said they were trying to locate Gwyneth and bring her in for evaluation. They'd finally gotten a last known address from some information Lily provided during the interview. Police were being sent to that location right now. Summer's face was grim as she explained that Dr. Keenan would be facing multiple criminal charges, including kidnapping, child endangerment, and medication theft. But the case was complicated because Lily kept saying her father was trying to save her mother. Summer said that according to Lily, her mother Gwyneth has kidney disease and needs a transplant. Lily is a perfect match, but Gwyneth has been refusing the surgery for months. She's terrified that something will go wrong during the operation, and Lily will be left alone or worse, that her ex-husband will somehow use her medical vulnerability to take their daughter away from her. Keenan apparently told Lily that her mother was dying, and that only Lily could save her, but her mother was being stubborn and wouldn't accept help. Summer said the whole situation was heartbreaking, because everyone involved was operating from a place of fear and desperation, and love all twisted up together in the worst possible way. The next morning, Carlos Guidry called an emergency meeting in the hospital's main conference room. I sat between Carla and Harper while Carlos paced at the front of the room looking like he hadn't slept. He explained that the board was worried about lawsuits and bad press, that we needed to review every single protocol for medication security and employee background checks. Harper shifted in his seat when Carlos mentioned that staff members who witness suspicious behavior need to report it immediately, regardless of who's involved. I caught Harper's eye and nodded, trying to tell him without words that he did the right thing. Carlos talked for 20 minutes about new badge access systems and mandatory reporting training, but all I could think about was Lily and her mother. After the meeting ended, I found Summer in the hallway outside the pediatric wing. She was on her phone again, coordinating something that sounded urgent. When she hung up, I asked if there was any update on Gwyneth. Summer's face went serious as she explained that police had located Gwyneth at her apartment across town and found her collapsed on the bathroom floor. Her kidneys were shutting down and she needed immediate medical care. I volunteered right away to be there when they brought Gwyneth in, thinking maybe my familiar face would help Lily feel less scared about seeing her mom in such bad shape. Summer agreed and said the ambulance was already on its way, maybe 30 minutes out. I used that time to find Lily in the room where Summer had left her with a child life specialist. Lily was coloring, but her hands were shaking so badly the crayons kept slipping. I sat down next to her and told her gently that her mom was coming to the hospital, that she was very sick, but the doctors here would take good care of her. Lily's eyes went wide and she asked if her mom was going to die. I couldn't lie to her, so I said the doctors would do everything they could, which seemed to satisfy her even though we both knew it wasn't really an answer. 2 hours crawled by before the ambulance finally pulled up to the emergency entrance. I stood with Summer and 2 ER nurses as the paramedics wheeled Gwyneth in on a stretcher. Her skin had this awful gray color that meant her body was poisoning itself, and she was barely awake enough to moan when they moved her. The ER team didn't waste time. They rushed her straight to intensive care while shouting orders about labs and IV access. I followed them as far as the ICU doors would let me, then turned back to find Lily. Summer had brought her down to a waiting area near the ICU, and the kid looked so small sitting in those big plastic chairs with her feet not even touching the floor. I tried to prepare her for what she was about to see, explaining that her mom would have tubes and machines hooked up to her, that it might look scary, but all of it was helping. Lily nodded, but I could tell she wasn't really hearing me. She just wanted to see her mother. The ICU nurse finally gave us permission to visit for 5 minutes. Summer and I walked Lily down the hallway to her mother's room, and the moment Lily saw Gwyneth hooked up to all those machines, she started screaming. Not crying, actual screaming that this was all her fault, that she should have gone with her dad, that she should have let him take her to save her mom. Summer and I both tried to calm her down, but Lily was beyond listening. She kept trying to climb onto her mother's bed and pull out the IVs like she could fix everything if she just got close enough. It took 3 nurses and a sedative to finally get Lily calm enough to move her to a quiet room. I sat with her while the medication kicked in, watching her eyes get heavy as she kept whispering that she was sorry. So sorry. A woman I didn't recognize came into the room about an hour later and introduced herself as Dr. Fleming, the transplant coordinator. She asked to speak with me privately in the hallway. Once we were alone, Dr. Fleming explained in a quiet voice that Gwyneth had maybe 2 weeks left without dialysis or a transplant. She'd been refusing treatment for months because of her fear, and now her condition was so bad that even if she agreed to the surgery, She might not survive it. The window was closing fast. I asked what would happen if Gwyneth kept refusing, and Dr. Fleming just shook her head like the answer was obvious. Later that afternoon, Detective Shepard called me and asked if we could meet at the hospital cafeteria. He looked tired when he sat down across from me with his coffee, and he got right to the point. He'd interviewed Dr. Keenan at the county jail and learned some things he thought I should know. Keenan had been secretly monitoring Gwyneth's medical records through the hospital database, watching her numbers get worse and worse while she refused to let Lily donate. Shepard said Keenan had access to patient files that he shouldn't have been able to see, but he'd been using his credentials to track his ex-wife's condition for months. The more I learned about Dr. Keenan's plan, the more twisted it became. Shepard explained that Keenan had arranged everything with a private clinic in another state, a place that would do the transplant surgery under false names with no questions asked. The medications he'd stolen from the hospital were meant to keep Lily sedated during the drive across state lines. He'd been planning this for weeks, getting more desperate as Gwyneth's health got worse and she kept refusing. Shepard said Keenan's desperation had made him sloppy, that he'd left a trail of phone calls and emails that made it clear this wasn't a sudden impulse, but a carefully thought-out crime. The next day, Summer brought me into a case conference at the courthouse. The family court judge assigned to Lily's custody case was an older woman with gray hair pulled back tight and eyes that looked like they'd seen every kind of family mess possible. She listened to Summer's report, the detective's findings, and the hospital social worker's assessment without interrupting. When everyone finished talking, the judge leaned back in her chair and said bluntly that this was one of the most complicated cases she'd seen in 30 years. Everyone in that room was both right and wrong at the same time, she said, and there were no good answers, only less bad ones. The judge asked me directly to provide testimony about Lily's emotional state and her relationship with both parents. I explained how scared Lily had been when her father first came into her hospital room, how she'd begged me not to leave her alone with him. But I also had to tell the judge about how desperate Lily became later, how she'd fought the police officers and begged them to take her back to her dad when she thought it would save her mother. The judge wrote notes the whole time I talked, her face giving away nothing about what she was thinking. After the conference ended, the hospital social worker pulled me aside and said she'd connected Gwyneth with a therapist who worked with trauma survivors and people with medical anxiety. When Gwyneth finally woke up enough to really understand where she was, her first words were asking about Lily. The social worker had to tell her that Lily was safe but in temporary foster care, and Gwyneth just broke down crying so hard the nurses worried she'd hurt herself. Summer found me in the break room 2 hours later and said she'd gotten permission for me to visit Gwyneth in the ICU. I grabbed my badge and followed her down the hallway, my stomach tight with nerves about what I'd find. The ICU was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors and the hiss of oxygen machines. Gwyneth was in a corner room with glass walls, so the nurses could see her at all times. She looked so small in that big hospital bed, her skin gray and her arms covered in IV lines. Summer waited outside while I walked in and pulled a chair next to the bed. Gwyneth's eyes opened when I sat down, and she stared at me for a long moment before her hand shot out and grabbed mine with surprising strength. Her fingers dug into my palm as she pulled me closer. She asked me to tell Lily she was sorry, that she thought she was protecting her, but only made everything worse. Her voice cracked on the last word, and tears started running down her face. I squeezed her hand back and told her she could tell Lily herself when she was ready, but Gwyneth just shook her head and kept crying. She started talking faster, the words spilling out like she'd been holding them in for too long. She said she'd been frozen by fear for months, fear that the surgery would fail, and she'd die anyway, fear that her ex would use her medical crisis to take Lily away, fear that putting her daughter through the trauma of donation would damage her forever. She looked right at me and said she'd rather die than risk Lily's safety. The way she said it made my blood run cold because I could tell she genuinely believed every word. I sat there for a minute trying to figure out what to say. Then I asked her gently if dying and leaving Lily orphaned or in her father's custody was really safer than accepting help. Her face went blank and she stared at me with hollow eyes that looked like they'd seen too much pain. She whispered that she didn't know anymore, that 3 years of running and hiding had broken something inside her, and she couldn't think clearly about what was right. I stayed with her for another 20 minutes while she cried and talked in circles about her fears. When I finally left the room, Summer was waiting in the hallway with her tablet. Detective Shepard called me later that afternoon while I was checking on another patient. He said Keenan had been cooperating fully with the investigation and had provided detailed information about everything he'd planned. His lawyer was already building a defense argument that his actions were illegal, but motivated by trying to save his ex-wife's life, and that he never intended to harm Lily. Shepard sounded tired when he explained that the case was getting more complicated by the hour because nobody fit neatly into the categories of victim or criminal. I asked what would happen next, and he said the prosecutor would be contacting me soon to understand the medical side of things. Sure enough, the prosecutor showed up at the hospital the next morning. She was a sharp-looking woman in a dark suit who got right to business. She wanted to know about the medications Keenan had stolen and whether they could have hurt Lily. I explained that the anesthetics and sedatives he took were dangerous if used wrong, but his medical training meant he probably knew the proper doses. The prosecutor frowned and made notes on her legal pad. She said that complicated the child endangerment charges because it was harder to prove he put Lily in danger when he had the knowledge to use the drugs safely. We talked for almost an hour about dosing and medical protocols, and I could tell she was frustrated that the case wasn't as simple as it first seemed. Summer worked fast to arrange supervised visits between Lily and her mother. The first visit happened 3 days after Gwyneth woke up. Summer brought Lily to the hospital, and I met them in the hallway outside Gwyneth's room. Lily looked scared and small, her hands twisted together in front of her stomach. Summer gave her an encouraging smile and opened the door. The visit was painful to watch. Lily stood frozen near the door while Gwyneth tried to smile from her bed, tubes and wires connecting her to machines that beeped and hummed. Lily started crying before anyone said a word. Gwyneth held out her arms and Lily ran to her, sobbing into her mother's shoulder while Gwyneth stroked her hair and whispered things I couldn't hear. The dialysis machine next to the bed kept up its steady rhythm, a constant reminder of why we were all there. I stayed near the doorway, giving them space but ready to step in if needed. After about 10 minutes, Lily pulled back and looked at her mother's face. She asked why Gwyneth wouldn't just do the surgery so they could go home and be a family again. Gwyneth's face crumpled and she struggled to find words an 8-year-old could understand. She tried to explain about being scared and wanting to keep Lily safe, but her explanations came out tangled and confused. Lily listened for a while and then said something that made my throat tight. She said she wanted to help, that she wasn't scared of the surgery, and that she needed her mom to be okay. Gwyneth completely fell apart at that, pulling Lily close and crying so hard her whole body shook. Dr. Fleming scheduled a meeting 2 days later to talk about the transplant process. She gathered Gwyneth, Lily, Summer, and me in a small conference room with comfortable chairs and a box of tissues on the table. Fleming was calm and straightforward as she explained exactly what the surgery would involve for both of them. She didn't sugarcoat the risks, but emphasized that with Lily as a perfect match, Gwyneth's chances of survival were good if they acted soon. She used simple words and drew diagrams to help Lily understand what would happen to her kidney and how it would help her mother. Lily asked smart questions about recovery time and whether it would hurt. Fleming answered everything honestly, and I could see Lily processing the information with a serious expression on her face. Gwyneth sat rigid in her chair, her hands gripping the armrests so hard her knuckles turned white. When Fleming finished explaining the medical details, Gwyneth asked the question that had clearly been eating at her. She wanted to know what would happen to Lily if something went wrong during the surgery, if Gwyneth died on the operating table or had complications afterward. Summer took over and explained the foster care system and how the court would handle custody decisions. She laid out the options in a gentle but clear way, not hiding the reality that Lily could end up in state care or with relatives. Gwyneth's face went pale as Summer talked. She seemed to shut down completely, her eyes going distant and her body going still. The rest of the meeting happened around her while she stared at nothing. I spent my lunch break the next day in the hospital library with my phone, searching for resources that might help. I found a domestic violence survivor support group that specialized in helping women who'd fled abusive relationships navigate ongoing legal and medical crises. They had counselors who understood trauma and could help Gwyneth work through her fears in a way that made sense. I wrote down all their contact information and went straight to Summer's office. She looked up from her computer when I knocked, and I handed her the paper with the support group details. She scanned it quickly and then picked up her phone to call them right away. I listened to her explain Gwyneth's situation to whoever answered, describing the medical crisis and the custody complications and the history of abuse. The support group sent someone the next day, a woman who introduced herself to me briefly in the hallway before going into Gwyneth's room. She had kind eyes and moved with the careful awareness of someone who understood trauma. I watched through the window as she pulled a chair close to Gwyneth's bed and settled in for what turned into a 2-hour conversation. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I saw Gwyneth's body language shift from rigid and defensive to something slightly softer. Her shoulders dropped a fraction, her hands unclenched from the sheets. When the woman left, she stopped to tell me that Gwyneth was thinking about things differently now, but she still wasn't ready to agree to the surgery. Summer appeared at my station 3 days later with paperwork in her hands and a serious expression. She explained that the family court judge had ordered a psychiatric evaluation for Gwyneth to figure out if her refusal was based on clear thinking or if the trauma was messing with her ability to make good decisions. I went straight to Gwyneth's room and found her furious, pacing as much as her IV lines would allow. She demanded to know why everyone thought she was crazy, why they couldn't just respect her choice. I let her vent for a few minutes before Summer arrived and calmly walked through the standard procedures in cases where a child's welfare was involved. She explained that the evaluation wasn't about declaring Gwyneth incompetent, just about understanding how her past experiences were affecting her current choices. Gwyneth finally sat down on the bed, exhausted and defeated. Meanwhile, the legal situation around Dr. Keenan was getting messier. His lawyer filed a motion arguing that his actions were justified by medical necessity, that Gwyneth's refusal to accept treatment was irrational and dangerous to their daughter. The prosecutor fired back that kidnapping could never be justified no matter what the motivation was, and the case started pulling in medical ethics experts and child welfare specialists. I got called to testify at Dr. Keenan's preliminary hearing 2 weeks later. I wore my scrubs because I was coming straight from a shift, and I felt weirdly exposed sitting in the witness box with everyone staring at me. The prosecutor asked me to describe what I'd witnessed, and I walked through everything from Lily's fear to Harper's testimony about the stolen medications. Dr. Keenan's lawyer stood up for cross-examination and tried to paint me as someone who didn't understand the full picture, who saw a scared child and jumped to conclusions without knowing about the mother's medical crisis. I held firm on what I'd seen and heard, on the terror in that little girl's eyes and the medications that could have hurt her if used wrong. The psychiatric evaluator met with Gwyneth over the next several weeks, spending hours in her hospital room talking through her history and her fears. When the report came back, it said that Gwyneth had serious trauma-related anxiety, but was mentally competent to make her own medical decisions. However, the evaluator strongly recommended intensive therapy to address how her past was impacting her judgment about Lily's welfare. Summer found me in the cafeteria on my lunch break and asked if we could talk privately. We moved to a quiet corner and she told me that the foster family caring for Lily was really struggling. The girl woke up screaming every night from nightmares. She refused to eat more than a few bites at each meal. She kept repeating that she needed to donate her kidney right now before it was too late, and the foster parents didn't know how to handle her desperation or help her feel safe. I asked Summer if there was anything I could do, and she suggested I might visit Lily if Carlos approved it. I went straight to the hospital administrator's office and knocked on his door. Carlos looked up from his computer and listened as I explained my request to visit Lily at her foster placement. He immediately started talking about liability concerns and hospital policy, and how I wasn't family or officially involved in the case. I pushed back, reminding him that I was the one who'd discovered what was happening, that Lily knew me and might feel safer with a familiar face. Summer backed me up when she arrived a few minutes later, and then we got word that Lily had specifically asked for me. Carlos finally agreed to supervised visits with Summer present. The foster home was a neat ranch house in a quiet neighborhood with toys scattered across the front yard. Summer and I walked up to the door together, and the foster mother let us in with a tired smile. Lily was sitting on the couch in an oversized sweatshirt, and my heart broke when I saw her. She'd lost weight. Her face was pale and drawn, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. She jumped up when she saw me and ran over, immediately asking if I could take her to the hospital right now to donate her kidney. I knelt down to her level and gently explained that it wasn't that simple, that there were medical tests and legal processes, and her mom had to agree first. Her face crumpled with frustration and fear. I spent the next hour sitting with Lily on the couch, letting her talk about everything she was feeling. She told me she loved her mom but was also really angry at her for refusing help. She said she understood her mom was scared, but she was scared too, scared of losing her mom forever and being left alone. She twisted the hem of her sweatshirt in her hands as she talked, her voice small but determined. Then she asked me about her dad, whether he was a bad person or just someone who made bad choices. I struggled with how to answer honestly without making things worse for her. I finally said that people could be both, that they could love you and still hurt you, and that was one of the hardest things about being human. She stared at me for a long moment, processing this, and then leaned against my shoulder with a shaky sigh. Before I left, the foster mother walked me to the door and touched my arm gently. She said Lily talked about me all the time, that I was the only person from that awful day who seemed to understand both her parents without judging either one. She asked if I would be willing to come back regularly, maybe once or twice a week, and I agreed right away without even thinking about it. The next morning I got a call from Fleming asking me to come to the hospital as soon as possible. When I arrived, she pulled me into her office and closed the door. Gwyneth's kidney function had dropped again overnight despite the dialysis. Fleming said they were running out of time, maybe a week before the surgery became too dangerous, even if Gwyneth changed her mind. After that week passed, it would just be a matter of waiting for the end. I asked if I could see Gwyneth and Fleming nodded, but warned me she wasn't in good shape emotionally. I found Gwyneth in her hospital bed crying quietly, her face turned toward the window. She looked up when I entered and wiped her eyes quickly. She told me she had written a letter to Lily explaining why she couldn't do the surgery, basically a goodbye letter. She asked if I would give it to her daughter when she died. I didn't take the letter from her hand. Instead, I sat down in the chair next to her bed and asked what she thought would happen to Lily after she was gone. Gwyneth said Lily would go live with her sister in California, that it was all arranged. I pressed for more details and watched her face change. She admitted her sister was overwhelmed with 3 kids of her own and had already said she couldn't really take on another child full-time. I asked gently what the court would do if her sister couldn't take Lily. Gwyneth stared at me without answering. I pointed out that the court might consider Keenan for custody despite everything he did, especially if he completed treatment programs, and his lawyer argued he was just trying to save her life. The color drained from Gwyneth's face as she realized what I was saying. She might be sending Lily straight into the situation she had spent 3 years running from. Her hands started shaking and she dropped the letter onto the blanket. 3 days later, Detective Shepard called me at work and asked if we could talk. He said Keenan had been asking to see both Lily and Gwyneth from jail, but both of them refused. His lawyer was pushing for a family meeting, claiming it might help resolve the medical crisis. The prosecutor was fighting against any contact because of the criminal charges. Shepard wanted to know what I thought, and I told him honestly I had no idea if it would help or make everything worse. Summer called that same afternoon and said she was setting up another case conference. This time the survivor advocate Maria would be there too. We met the next morning in Summer's office and talked for 2 hours about whether a supervised meeting might actually help. Maria said sometimes facing the abuser in a controlled setting could give survivors back some power, but it was risky. Summer worried about Lily being in the same room with her father after everything. I said I thought Gwyneth needed to hear directly from Keenan that he would stay away if she did the surgery, but I wasn't sure if we could trust anything he said. We finally agreed to recommend it to the judge with heavy supervision. The family court judge reviewed our recommendation and agreed to allow 1 meeting in a neutral location. She made it very clear this didn't affect the criminal case at all, and that any sign of manipulation or intimidation would end things immediately. Multiple professionals had to be present, including security officers. Summer called me that evening and asked if I would be present at the meeting since both Lily and Gwyneth trusted me. I said yes, but spent the whole night before barely sleeping, wondering if I was helping or making a terrible mistake. The morning of the meeting, I felt sick to my stomach driving to the courthouse. I kept thinking about Lily's face when she begged the officers to take her back to her father, and Gwyneth's terror when I mentioned Keenan might get custody. The meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning in a conference room on the 3rd floor. When I arrived, Summer was already there along with Detective Shepard, Maria, and 2 security officers standing by the door. The room had a long table with chairs on both sides and no windows. Gwyneth came in first with a victim advocate I didn't recognize, moving slowly and looking pale. Lily arrived next with her foster mother and immediately went to sit next to Gwyneth. Then they brought in Keenan wearing handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit. Lily's whole body went stiff when she saw him, but she didn't run away or scream. She just moved her chair closer to her mother and stared at the table. Keenan's eyes filled with tears the moment he saw his daughter, and he started to say something, but one of the security officers told him to wait until everyone was seated. Everyone took their seats slowly, the security officers staying close to the door while Summer sat at the head of the table with her notepad. Dr. Keenan lowered himself into the chair across from Gwyneth and Lily, his handcuffs making a soft clinking sound against the metal armrest. The room went completely quiet for a moment, nobody sure who should speak first. Then Dr. Keenan leaned forward as much as his restraints allowed and looked directly at Lily. Tears started rolling down his face before he even opened his mouth. He told her he was sorry for scaring her, that he knew what he did was wrong and he understood if she never wanted to see him again. His voice broke multiple times as he spoke, and I watched Lily's whole body go stiff in her chair. She didn't look at him, but she didn't run away either, just stared down at her hands folded in her lap. Dr. Keenan kept going, saying he never meant to hurt her or make her afraid, that he just couldn't watch her mother die when there was something he could do about it. The desperation in his voice was real, mixing with the remorse in a way that made the whole room feel heavy. One of the security officers shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the raw emotion filling the space. Gwyneth's hands were shaking on the table in front of her, and when she finally spoke, her voice came out rough and unsteady. She told Dr. Keenan that he had no right to talk about protecting their daughter after everything he put them through. She started listing things, her voice getting stronger as she went, talking about the years of controlling behavior, the times he grabbed her too hard, the night he shoved her into the wall while she held baby Lily. Dr. Keenan didn't try to defend himself or make excuses. He just nodded and said she was right about all of it. He admitted he was controlling and violent, that he hurt the people he loved most, and spent years trying to understand why. He told her he'd been in therapy for 2 years working through his issues, not because he thought it would bring them back, but because he needed to face what he'd done. Maria, the survivor advocate, was taking notes and watching Gwyneth carefully, probably checking for signs that this was too much for her. Gwyneth's advocate put a hand on her shoulder, a silent reminder that she could stop this anytime. Then Lily's small voice cut through all the tension like a knife. She said she was tired of everyone fighting about what was best for her when nobody ever asked what she actually wanted. Her hands were clenched into fists on the table, and her face was red from holding back tears. She looked at her mom and then at her dad and said all she wanted was for her mom to live and for her dad to stop being scary. The simplicity of it hit everyone in the room hard. Summer wrote something down quickly. Detective Shepard leaned back in his chair. I felt my throat get tight because she was right. We'd all been so focused on the legal stuff and the safety concerns that we forgot an 8-year-old was at the center of all this with her own feelings about it. Dr. Keenan looked at Gwyneth and his whole face changed, became more focused and less broken down. He told her he understood if she never forgave him and he wasn't asking for that. But he was begging her to accept the transplant for Lily's sake. He said he would sign away all his parental rights right now, accept whatever punishment the court wanted to give him, do anything she asked if she would just let their daughter save her life. His voice was steady now, not pleading but firm and clear. He said he'd already talked to his lawyer about giving up custody permanently, and he meant it. Gwyneth stared at him like she was trying to figure out if this was another manipulation, another way to control her. The advocate whispered something in her ear, but Gwyneth shook her head. The silence stretched out for what felt like forever, before Gwyneth finally broke down completely. She started crying so hard her whole body shook, and Lily immediately moved closer to her, wrapping her small arms around her mother's waist. Gwyneth said between sobs that she'd been so focused on protecting Lily from her father that she didn't see how her refusal was hurting their daughter in a different way. She admitted she was scared of the surgery, terrified actually, but she was more scared of leaving Lily alone in the world. She kept saying she was sorry over and over to Lily, and maybe to everyone in the room. Maria handed her some tissues and Summer gave her a minute to collect herself before asking if she wanted to continue the meeting or take a break. Gwyneth said she wanted to keep going. The meeting wrapped up about 20 minutes later with Gwyneth saying she would seriously consider the transplant and work with her therapist on her medical fears. Summer made notes about next steps and what kind of legal protections could be put in place. Dr. Keenan was let out by the security officers, still in handcuffs, but something had changed in the energy of the room. It felt like something that needed to break open had finally cracked, and now maybe there was space for actual solutions instead of everyone just being stuck. I walked out with Gwyneth and Lily, and the foster mother was waiting in the hallway to take Lily back. Gwyneth hugged her daughter tight before letting her go, promising they'd see each other tomorrow. Over the next 3 days, Gwyneth had intensive sessions with her therapist and Dr. Fleming and Maria. I visited her every single day during my breaks and after my shifts, watching as she slowly worked through the fear that had been controlling her decisions. The first day, she mostly cried and asked the same questions over and over about what could go wrong. The second day, she started asking more specific questions about the surgery itself, about recovery times and success rates, and what happened if her body rejected the kidney. By the third day, she was calmer, still scared but thinking more clearly about the actual risks versus the ones she'd built up in her head. Dr. Fleming brought in charts and medical studies, explaining everything in detail without sugarcoating anything. Maria talked with her about her trauma response and how it was affecting her ability to make decisions about her own medical care. I mostly just sat there and held her hand when she needed it, letting her talk through her fears without trying to fix everything. On the fourth day, Gwyneth told Summer she would agree to the transplant, but she had conditions. She wanted everything documented legally, so Dr. Keenan couldn't use this to claim custody later, and she wanted Lily to have ongoing therapy to process everything that had happened. Summer immediately started working with lawyers to draft up agreements that would protect everyone's interests. The paperwork took 2 days to put together because they had to make sure it would hold up in family court and that all the medical consent forms were proper. Gwyneth read through every single page, asking questions about specific phrases and clauses. The lawyers explained that Dr. Keenan would have to sign away his parental rights as part of the agreement, and that would be permanent and legally binding. Gwyneth signed the documents with a shaking hand, but she signed them. Meanwhile, Dr. Keenan's lawyer was negotiating a plea deal with the prosecutor. The lawyer argued that given the unusual circumstances and Gwyneth's support of the arrangement, a reduced sentence made sense. Dr. Keenan agreed to plead guilty to both the kidnapping and the medication theft charges. In exchange, he would get a lighter sentence and be required to complete a domestic violence treatment program. The big thing was he would permanently give up all parental rights to Lily, which he agreed to immediately. The prosecutor took a few days to consider it but finally agreed, partly because Gwyneth herself asked them to accept the deal. She said she wanted this to be over so they could focus on the transplant and moving forward. The judge still had to approve everything, but the lawyer said that was likely to happen. The transplant got scheduled for the following week, which gave both Lily and Gwyneth time to prepare physically and emotionally for what was coming. I was there when Dr. Fleming sat down with Lily to explain exactly what would happen during the surgery. Lily listened carefully, sitting up straight in her chair and asking questions that seemed way too grown up for an 8-year-old. She wanted to know how long the surgery would take, how long until she could go back to the school, whether it would hurt a lot afterward. Dr. Fleming answered every question honestly, not talking down to her but also not making it sound scarier than it needed to be. Lily nodded along and then asked the question that really mattered to her, whether her mom would be okay. Dr. Fleming told her that the surgery had very good success rates with living donors, especially when the match was as good as theirs was. Lily seemed satisfied with that answer, and said she was ready to do it whenever they needed her to. The day before the surgery, I went to see both of them in their separate hospital rooms. Lily was in the pediatric wing, sitting cross-legged on her bed and practicing the breathing exercises the child life specialist had taught her earlier that morning. She counted slowly, in through her nose and out through her mouth, her small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. When she saw me, she stopped and gave me a nervous smile. I sat down on the edge of her bed and asked how she was feeling. She admitted she was scared, but said she knew this was the right thing to do. Her hands fidgeted with the edge of her blanket, but her voice stayed steady. I told her she was incredibly brave and that everything would be okay. Then I walked down 2 floors to the adult surgical wing where Gwyneth was waiting. She looked pale and shaky when I entered, her fingers gripping a small stuffed elephant that Lily had given her that afternoon. The elephant had a note pinned to it that said, "For courage," in Lily's careful handwriting. Gwyneth's eyes were red from crying, but she nodded when I asked if she was ready. She whispered that she had to be ready because Lily was counting on her to survive this. The surgery started at 7 in the morning and took 8 full hours. I spent most of that time in the surgical waiting room with Summer and Maria, drinking bad coffee and watching the clock move slower than seemed possible. Summer kept checking her phone for updates from the surgical team, and Maria read the same magazine 3 times without seeming to absorb any of it. Around noon, a nurse came out to tell us that Lily's surgery had finished and everything had gone well. They'd removed her kidney successfully and she was stable. 2 hours later, another update came that Gwyneth's surgery was also going smoothly, and the kidney was functioning properly in her body. We all breathed a little easier after that. Finally, at 3 in the afternoon, Dr. Fleming emerged from the surgical wing with a tired smile on her face. She told us both surgeries had gone perfectly. The kidney was working well, and both patients were stable in the recovery unit. Summer actually hugged Maria, and I felt tears running down my face before I even realized I was crying. They let me visit them in the ICU after they woke up from anesthesia. I went to Lily first because she'd been asking for me according to the nurses. She was groggy and had tubes running from her arm, but her eyes focused on me when I walked in. Her first words were asking if her mom was okay. I told her yes, that the surgery had worked, and her mom's new kidney was doing its job perfectly. Lily smiled for the first time in weeks, a real genuine smile that made her whole face light up despite the pain medication making her sleepy. I squeezed her hand gently and told her she'd done something amazing. Then I went to see Gwyneth in the next wing over. She was more awake than Lily had been, probably because her body was responding so well to having a functioning kidney again. When she saw me, she started crying and kept whispering thank you over and over. I sat with her for 20 minutes while she cried and talked about how grateful she was to Lily and how she couldn't believe this was real. The recovery process stretched out over weeks and got complicated in ways I hadn't expected. Both of them needed constant monitoring to make sure Gwyneth's body wasn't rejecting the kidney and that Lily's remaining kidney was adjusting properly to doing all the work. I visited them regularly during my shifts, sometimes stopping by before or after work just to check in. Slowly, I watched color return to Gwyneth's face as her body started functioning normally again. Her skin went from that awful gray tint to a healthy pink. Lily's energy came back gradually too, though she tired easily at first. By the third week, Lily was walking the hallways with a physical therapist, and Gwyneth was sitting up in bed reading books that Maria brought her. The doctors kept running tests and adjusting medications, but the overall trend was positive. They were both healing, physically at least. While they recovered in the hospital, Summer was working with the family court to establish a permanent custody arrangement. The process took several weeks of paperwork and meetings with lawyers and social workers. In the end, Gwyneth retained full custody of Lily with support services put in place to help them transition. Dr. Keenan's parental rights were terminated as part of the plea agreement he'd signed. The judge made it official in a brief hearing that neither Gwyneth nor Lily attended. Summer also set up trauma therapy for Lily with a specialist who worked with kids who'd experienced domestic violence and medical trauma. Lily started her sessions while still in the hospital, meeting with the therapist twice a week in a small office on the pediatric floor. The therapist told me later that Lily was processing everything remarkably well for her age, but that it would be a long road ahead. 3 months after the surgery, I saw both of them for a routine follow-up appointment. The change was remarkable. Gwyneth's kidney function was excellent according to all the lab results, and Lily's remaining kidney had adapted well to handling everything on its own. They'd moved out of the temporary housing Summer had arranged and into a new apartment in a safer neighborhood across town. Gwyneth told me about the domestic violence survivor support group she'd joined, how talking with other women who'd been through similar situations was helping her rebuild her confidence. She'd even started working part-time at a library, shelving books and helping with children's programs. Lily was back in the school and making friends, according to Gwyneth. She'd joined an art club and was sleeping through the night most of the time now. They both looked healthier and happier than I'd ever seen them. Dr. Keenan's sentencing happened around the same time. The judge gave him 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years of probation. He had to complete a domestic violence treatment program as part of his sentence. I heard from Summer that he'd been participating fully in the program and seemed genuinely committed to understanding what he'd done wrong. He wrote a letter to Lily apologizing for everything and explaining why he'd made the choices he did. Gwyneth kept the letter sealed in an envelope, planning to give it to Lily when she was older and could process it better. Dr. Keenan had accepted through his lawyer that he would never see his daughter again. He knew she was safe and healthy, and according to what Summer told me, that seemed to be enough for him. He'd lost everything, but at least his ex-wife and daughter were alive and healing. I saw Lily and Gwyneth one more time for a follow-up appointment 6 months after the transplant. Walking into the exam room, I barely recognized them at first. Lily had grown taller and her hair was longer, pulled back in a ponytail. She was wearing jeans and a t-shirt with paint stains on it from art class. Gwyneth looked younger somehow, the stress and fear that had aged her face gone now. She told me about her full-time job at the library and the apartment they were decorating together. Lily talked excitedly about her friends at the school and the sleepover she was going to next weekend. When it was time for me to leave, they both hugged me tightly. Gwyneth thanked me again for believing them and fighting for them when everything seemed impossible. Lily just held on and told me she was happy now. Standing there with both of them, I realized that nothing about this situation had been perfect or fair. Dr. Keenan had committed crimes and hurt people he loved. Gwyneth had nearly died because fear controlled her decisions. Lily had been caught in the middle of adult problems she never should have faced. But somehow, through all the mess and pain and complicated choices, they'd found their way to something real. Not a fairy tale ending, just two people learning to live without fear and building a life together one day at a time. That was enough.